training. He was my first rabbi. He did a bunch of different congregations in New York, in Memphis, and somewhere down over in Australia. And he can be a really funny guy, but he's really smart too. So take it away, Dr. Drain.
Thank you for that, Larry. It's a privilege to be here and do this. I will start to share my screen straight away. What is anti-Semitism? Oxford Dictionary says the hatred of and hostility toward Jews, at times including the belief they pose a threat to society and should be eliminated. Some people have called this the longest hatred. Some have called it a baseless hatred. Strangely, many hating Jews have never actually met a Jewish person. They've never been to Israel. And you hear the chants, and sadly we heard the chants here in Australia, on a day that they were going to light up the Opera House in Australia to recognise the tragedies of 7th of October, a massacre by Hamas. Muslims gathered down in front of the Opera House and there chanted, gas the Jews, kill the Jews, from the river to the sea, finish what Hitler started, and all these kind of things. And the police stood by and let them do it. One of the atrocities of Australia. But notice all these signs, from the river to the sea means the eradication of Israel and that of establishment of an Arab state, Muslim state called Palestine. Won't even be Christian Arabs, only Muslim within there. The amazing thing is, in spite of Israel being attacked by Hamas, a terrorist organisation, on the 7th of October, from that time on for the next 2 weeks, even the USA recorded anti-Semitism rose 400% in the 2 weeks that followed. So massive anti-Semitism. We're going to start Romans 11:11. I say that they, that is the Jewish people, did not stumble so as to fall, did they? So ask the question, expecting a positive answer. May it never be. This is a Greek word, nergeneto, which absolutely not. But by their false steps, salvation's come to the Gentiles. Why? To provoke Israel to jealousy. The church is very quick to point out Israel's failures in the scriptures and in history. But what about the church failure? And we're going to use a lot of information here from part of it from Michael Brown's book on Our Hands Are Stained with Blood. There's another book I'll show to you in a moment as well. But on page 91 of Brown's book, he has a quote there from Eliezer Berkowitz, who's he was an Orthodox theologian. He's an educator. He's not anti-Christian. He's just one who is an educator. And he wrote there, after 19 centuries of Christianity, the extermination of 6 million Jews, among them 1.5 million children, carried out in cold blood in the very heart of Christian Europe, encouraged by the criminal silence of virtually all Christendom, including that of an infallible Holy Father in Rome. It was a natural culmination of this bankruptcy. A straight line leads from the first act of oppression against the Jews in Judaism in the 4th century to the Holocaust in the 20th century. Sadly, we find that even today, how silent even the church has been over the attacks against Israel. I want to actually start by going all the way back even into the Old Testament. And we find back there in Exodus chapter 1, one of the first mass examples of anti-Semitism, where we find Pharaoh oppressing the Hebrews, the Jews, known as Hebrews back then, or those from Israelites later, just because of their race. There was reasons he did it. However, the fact is he did do it. And you know the story of killing all the babies under 2 years of age. We need to skip over so many individual occurrences that we could come up. We want to focus on the game changers. One of the other big game changers is that of Amalek. Amalek is a descendant of Esau, Esau's grandson. And Amalek tried to fight back for Esau's lack of the land because of the birthright issues. They tried to destroy Israel as they left. And in 1 Samuel chapter 15, in Israel's first king, you want a king, great, but kings go to war. God said, you go to war, but against Amalek. We have to take revenge on Amalek because they tried to wipe out Israel as they left Egypt. And you know the story in 1 Samuel 15, Saul was ordered to wipe out, but he left many alive, especially the leaders, and especially that of Agag, the king. And we find later, hundreds of years later, Esther there in Persia, which is modern Iran, which is still against Israel, tries to wipe out by Haman. We know the story there of Purim, of Haman and Agite. He was an Amalekite, and he tried to wipe out them. So because Saul disobeyed then, so Haman comes in all those years later. And then later, interestingly, after the Holocaust, at the Nuremberg trials, they found 10 of the Nazis guilty and they were going to hang them. They self-confessed that this is Purim time all over again. So again, the ongoing effects of the disobedience of Saul all the way through. Also, we find in history that of Edom. Again, Edom is descended from Esau as well. And the scripture refers to their having a burning hatred against Israel. I've left some scripture verses there for you to look at later, but one of the last Edomites who you might recall is actually Herod. He is an Edomite. So was he of mixed blood? Yes, possibly, but he is from Edom. Again, hatred there, that baseless hatred, and like Egypt, all the ways, a couple of thousand years beforehand, tries to wipe out all the babies under 2 years of age. The picture I have up there with the Hebrew writing is actually on the fence of the kibbutz that faces into Gaza that was put up shortly after October 7th. And the sign of the kibbutz says, remember what Amalek did to you. In other words, they tie the attack of Hamas on October the 7th to that of Amalek. So again, the memory continues on. Again, we know that of the Philistines. That is modern Gaza. That's modern Gaza. Hamas is the place of the Philistines. We know, if you know of history, that the Roman name for the region was changed in 135 from that of Israel to that of Philistia in Latin, which becomes Philistines or Palestine in English. The Phoenicians were always attacking into Israel. That's modern Lebanon. Damascus was always attacking into Israel over history. Again, modern Syria. Antiochus Epiphanes. You know the story there because it's Hanukkah. You should know the story. Tried to eradicate Jewish life, Jewish scriptures, and eradicate the word of God. The Maccabees rose up against Antiochus IV, and Hanukkah is what we celebrate today to remember that. I've got the Hanukkah menorah back on the shelf there. Here in Australia, we're about to go into the third night of Hanukkah, so I've got 3 candles set up there already. But one thing I want to point to, if you've never seen the photo up here of a menorah in front of a swastika outside, this was taken actually in about the mid-1930s. Rabbi Akiva and his wife Rachel Posner put this Hanukkah menorah up there, and she wrote on a photo on the back of it, said, Judah dies, says the Nazi banner. Judah will live forever, responds the lights. And I think what a brave act to still put up the lights there. You might recognize the photo down below of the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin. It's interesting, used to have Nazi flags there, but now in front is a big Hanukkah menorah that they light every year, which is really making a statement against what was there. It's interesting, Anna and myself were in Warsaw this time last year, and there was this big, massive Hanukkah right in front of the big communist Russian building that was built as a symbol of Russian domination against Poland during the time when they had ruled over Poland. Now they have this big Hanukkah menorah set up there as a statement against Russia and against things as well. I would note that not every army attacking Israel was anti-Semitic. It's just that Israel was at the crossroads of the world. They were just in the way. And also persecution happened because Israel refused to worship other gods. But many of the countries that did come in were anti-Semitic. Again, I wish we had time to break down every one of those. The baseless hatred. Why is this baseless hatred within there? Well, it is a spiritual battle, folks. It's a spiritual battle we're facing here, especially as we go more into the end times. We're going to find this increasing more and more and more. It's a spiritual battle. The enemy knows why he wants humanity to destroy Israel and the Jewish people, but often humanity itself does not know. But it comes down to land, and it comes down to blessing. That of the land, Ishmael, the descendants of Ishmael is the Arabs, but please understand, Islam has got nothing to do with Ishmael. That is two totally separate issues. Islam came 2,600 years after Ishmael. Ishmael was not Muslim, although that's the claim, but he was not Muslim. There's also the argument about with Esau and those that I've just shared rising up against. But remember, Torah was given to us at Mount Sinai. Torah can be seen as God's wedding contract, his ketubah, because at Sinai we enter into this divine covenant marriage with. When you hear in the New Testament talks about being the bride of Messiah, that's based on this situation at Sinai where Israel became Adonai's bride. And again, the ketubah is the wedding contract. You do this for me, I'll do that for you, and together we'll do this, and then we'll have a happy divine covenant marriage together. From that time on, the enemy tried to destroy Torah. How many times through history has the enemy tried to destroy Torah over and again repeatedly? Then there is the land. The land can be seen as the wedding gift by Adonai to Israel. It's the dowry. That's why the enemy from the very beginning has sought to destroy and steal the land, because to just take away the dowry, you take away the wedding. Ezekiel chapter 35, Psalm 35, Psalm 83, these are all important ones within there, and they hate me without a cause. There's a common statement there in the Psalms, hated without a cause. In Psalm 83, it says there, God, do not keep silent, do not hold your peace. Oh God, do not be still, for look, your enemies make an uproar. Those who hate you lift up their head. They make a shrewd plot against your people, conspiring against your treasured ones. Come, they say, let us wipe them out as a nation. Let Israel's name be remembered no more. And we see this attack going on even to this day. Again, so many times we could spend in the older covenant to see about the anti-Semitism there, but I want to move quickly into that of the New Testament. There's a blood libel that comes out of the New Testament. The blood libel is the Jews crucified Jesus. They are the Christ killers. They are the God killers. And from that statement, there's a concept of we need to avenge the blood of Christ. I'm saying that in those terminologies because that's what's actually used there. And they frequently quote the saying of the Sadducees who made the statement, Matthew chapter 27, verse 25, let his blood, that is Yeshua's blood, be on us and on our children. So they're happy to oblige. The total misunderstanding of the number of times the word the Jews are used in the book of John, 63 times. I've actually written an article about this and published it with the Lausanne Consultation for Jewish Evangelism. If you're interested, email me and I can send you a copy of that. The same way, the 3 times the word the Jews are used in the book of Acts, where Paul says there that I'm leaving the synagogue and now I'm going to the Gentiles, has been interpreted by the church over the millennials there of being rejection against the Jewish people. Now the movement of God is no longer with Jews, it is now with the Gentiles. And they also point out many times Yeshua's challenges in the New Testament to the Jewish people, but they forget this is in-house criticism. It's family, talking with family. In fact, much of what Yeshua said to challenge the people of his day, later the Jewish Talmud challenges. And that was written 400 and even 600 years for the 2 different Talmud later. And they did many of the same challenges about the hypocrisy and about how we're living our lives against it. A lot of people don't realize that Romans is actually written against anti-Semitism of Gentiles in the church. Claudius, the emperor, expelled Jews from Rome in around 42 to 53, where he ruled there. And we actually read about that in Acts chapter 18, where it talks about Priscilla and Aquila had been booted out of Rome. And there's debates over why he was kicked out, but there's actually a written record. He was kicked out because of the debates over who was actually the Messiah. So Claudius said, Jews out. And left the Christians there and the Gentiles, and they started populating all the places in the church. Later, after Claudius left or died, assassinated, I forget which, Nero comes back into power, and Nero invites the Jews back in. They come to take their place in the church, and now the Gentiles in the church are blocking the Jews from coming back in and taking their place. So there's this big conflict that's happening there in Rome. So Paul writes a letter of Romans against the anti-Semitism of the Gentiles in the church, because we find already replacement theology is brooding there within there. There's a big pushback in the church because, the Jews being called the chosen people. I love the line out of Fiddler on the Roof where Tevye says, I know, we're the chosen people, but once in a while, couldn't you choose somebody else for a while? A classic line of, hey, relieve the pressure on us. Can anti-Semitism be blamed on the New Covenant, the New Testament, or is it just anti-Semites weaponizing the New Testament for their existing baseless hatred? This is a discussion all on itself. But the situation happened. Gentiles began to outpopulate the Jews in the church, especially outside Israel in the diaspora. And the trouble is, most new Gentile believers coming and accepting Yeshua, Jesus, as being their Messiah, knew nothing of Israel, nothing of the Jewish thing, nothing of Jewish ways. And the church slowly began to drift and become estranged from the Jewish roots and all the biblical customs. And a leadership switch began to happen. The Jews got out of leadership, especially out in the diaspora, and now Gentiles come in who knew nothing about Jewish ways. In fact, some people even say the book of John was written to educate the Gentiles out there in the Jewish world about Jewish ways. And there becomes this shift that happens even later with the conversion of the Roman emperors, particularly that of Constantine. We'll get to that in a moment. Christianity becomes a sole established religion of the Roman Empire, and the early church fathers sought to establish Christianity as the successor to Judaism, the pathway which they took. And the refusal of Jews to accept Yeshua, Jesus, as their Messiah, especially that of the Gentile presentation, was viewed as a threat to later Roman leaders and to Christianity, and so persecution begins to begin. We're going to go through a few of the game changers. This is the early church anti-Semitism, drawing here from both Michael Brown's book as well as Melnick's book here, so you can buy those later and look at them. By the way, as I'm going through there, if you want to keep up with it, folks, take a snapshot of the screen. You'll be able to keep up with everything that I'm saying if you want to look at it later. But we're going to have a quick look at some game changers. First of all, a heretic, but he was popular. He was an influencer, Marcion. Marcion looked at this and said the Jewish God is a different God to the Christian God, and he's an inferior God to the Christian God. And Marcion rejected all of the Old Testament because it was tied to the Jewish people, and said the Old Testament, the Tanakh, is a product of a lesser God. He was quickly overruled with that by the leaders out there, but they accepted the concept of the Jewish God being a different God. Judaism, Marcion said, was not only an incomplete revelation, it was also a false revelation. But again, he was a heretic, so a number of his things got pushed back on. But one of the ones who wasn't a heretic, but one of the first fathers of the church, the third bishop of Antioch, Ignatius, his influence continued on all the way through, even to this day. And he wrote in there, and again, so many things we could bring up with all these different ones. So I'm just picking up a few of the things that they've said. Ignatius said, if we are still practicing Judaism, we admit that we have not received God's favor. It is wrong to talk about Jesus Christ and live like Jews, for Christianity did not believe in Judaism, but Judaism in Christianity. Therefore, he ruled then early, very early, it's wrong to practice Judaism. It seems to forget that Christianity was born within Judaism. But again, so many of these things we could spend a whole session on, pushing back on what they said and the answer to what they said. Justin Martyr was a game changer. He wrote a book based on the dialogue with Trypho the Jew. And Justin used the growing allegorical interpretation style of his day to make the scriptures say whatever he wanted them to say. And we could go through a whole list of all the different things that he said. But one example out of many we give, Isaiah chapter 42, where it says they interpreted the Messiah didn't come for the Jews, but for the Gentiles. And he twisted it to say, in his name shall all the Gentiles trust. So therefore, the only reason Messiah came was for the Gentiles, not for the Jews. And he wrote, we from Christ are the true sons of God, and we keep the commandments of Christ. So now he is actually considered as the first one to push that the church had replaced Israel. He's many times seen as the father of replacement theology, also known as supersessionism. Again, we could spend so much time on what he wrote, but he influenced others. Tertullian, the father of Latin Christianity, the father actually of Western theology. So it's important to listen to what he said. He said that Gentiles have been chosen by God to replace the Jews. Again, these built on each other's. Because they, that is the Gentiles, were more worthy and more honorable than the Jews. In his writings against the Jews, he talks about the irrelevance of the Mosaic covenant, and in so doing, the irrelevance of Jews. And he claimed that all the blessing of ethnic Israel passed on to what he called the other nation of God, which is the Christian church. It's funny how all the blessings pass on, but none of the curses pass on. They remain with the Jews, but all the blessing pass on. Very convenient theology. David Ephraim said here, the road to Auschwitz is long and may not be direct, but one can get there from here. This is as early as the 200 years of the Christian era. You could get to Auschwitz from this place. Another game changer, Origen of Alexander. He's considered the father of allegorical interpretation, enabling him to say the Jews didn't understand Tanakh, they didn't live Tanakh. The Gentile Christians are the true Jews, the true Israel. The church, he said, has replaced Israel. And he now comes up with the big blood libel. The Jews killed Yeshua, and he calls it the most abominable of crimes of all of history. And now the chant of Christ killers begins to come into the speech of the church. Again, from that starts to build the concept that now the church has to avenge the death of Christ by wiping out the Jews. As early as this, it starts to take shape, tragically so. One of the church fathers also, Augustine of Hippo. Most of you should know of Augustine. We're just going to briefly cover a couple of things he said. Sadly and tragically, the one who shaped so much of Western theology, building on what earlier ones had done, but he is often seen as the father of a lot of Western theology. He said, the Jews are a subset of those damned to hell. The Jews are responsible, fully responsible for Yeshua's death. Jews are enslaved to the church. If you're a Jew, you are the church's slave. And along with Cyprian, the whole schism that went there, they declared there's no salvation outside the church. That is the established Orthodox Church of the day, not even any of the other groups outside, not any of the Messianic Jews, not any of the other groups that are around. Only within the formal Orthodox Church is salvation found. So definitely not with Judaism, and also not with Messianic Jews of the day. They claimed, and he wrote there, how the Jews with Yeshua held and insulted and bound and crowned with thorns and dishonored Yeshua by spitting and scourging and abused and hung him on the tree. But again, like I say here, like all others, Augustine ignored that the Romans did these actions. He died on a Roman cross, not a Jewish stoning, but a Roman cross. And Yeshua had declared, no one takes my life, I lay it down. They forgot that Yeshua came for the purpose of dying. So if you want to blame the Jews, thank the Jews for what happened. Don't blame, but say that's why Yeshua came. But again, it was the Romans who did it, so we can blame the Italians. However, the Italians made up with pizza and macaroni, so we can forgive them and we can move on. Don't get me into trouble with that one, Phyllis. I know you're watching from New York. A few councils come along here. Again, we don't have time to look at all the councils. One came out of Spain in 305 that decided in this council to keep Jews and Christians apart by ordering Christians not to even share a meal with the Jew, not to marry Jews, not to use Jews to even bless their fields, bless their crops, and definitely don't observe the Jewish Sabbath. Now, already there's a shift from Saturday to Sunday going on in the church, and it's happening. People say that Constantine changed that. No, it's already going on because the Sunday morning of resurrection started to take place. The early church met for Havdalah. That way, end of the Sabbath and also the beginning of the first day of the week. So again, that was an important time. But again, to move quickly to Constantine, the emperor, he issued 2 edicts that passed massive changes for Israel. First of all, 315, the Edict of Milan said there's a death penalty now for if you circumcise your slaves, if you embrace Judaism, if Jews convert Christians to Judaism, even if they were previously Jewish. So if you bring Jews back into believing Judaism, that's a death penalty. A death penalty for interfaith marriage. Death penalty for even if you attended a synagogue. So again, Emperor Constantine changed that as part of his statement that now he was a Christian and that the Roman Empire now was now a Christian empire. Christians now were protected under this new empire system of a Christian empire under Constantine. However, now the Jews, which previously had a form of protection under the Roman pagan empire, now massively lost all their protection under Christian Roman Empire. It was on to the Council of Nicaea in 325. Different people of the church were invited to that of leaders, but no Messianic Jews or those of the what they call the schism groups were invited along. They met primarily to discuss the deity of Yeshua against the heretics of the day, especially that of Arius. Again, it's another whole teaching of its own. But they set Sunday as being the day of worship, making it illegal to meet on the Sabbath. They also banned all Jewish practices such as Pesach and substituted Pesach with the pagan goddess of Ishtar, which you know as Easter. So that's where you get the fertility cultus cycles in there, the Easter eggs, the Yuletide logs, and all these other things added within there. These objectives remain constant throughout the centuries and were built upon one upon the other. John Chrysostom, you've got a list, you won't be able to say it properly. They called him the Golden Mouth because he preached so beautifully, and he was an awesome preacher, but he gave 8 sermons against the Jews, against Judaizers, and listened what he wrote within these sermons. And he preached The synagogue is worse than a brothel. It is a den of scoundrels and the repair of wild beasts, the temple of demons devoted to idolatrous cults, the refuge of brigands and debaucheries, the cavern of devils. It is a criminal assembly of Jews, a place for the assassins of Christ, a house worse than a drinking shop, a den of thieves, a hills of iniquity, a refuse of devils, a gulf, an abyss of perdition. The Jews murder their offspring and emulate them or dedicate them to the devil. And he referred to Jewish practices as a disease and declared he wanted to drive this perverse custom from the church in direct reference to that of Sukkot, that of tabernacles. You think about this being one of the first early church fathers. His influence went all the way through history. There are those who say that his homilies, his sermons, were the decisive turn in the history of Christian anti-Judaism, a turn whose ultimate disfiguring consequence was enacted in the political anti-Semitism of Adolf Hitler. And his work as an attempt to really was used to legitimize the Holocaust in the eyes of the German and the Austrian Christians. They supported it. That's the shocker. The church supported the Holocaust, and based on writings like John Chrysostom and others that we've just seen. They wrote a thing called the Codex Theodosianus, that means the book, and they put in place their imperial laws made from the Roman emperors of the Christian Rome, that is, against Jews that would later be built on through the centuries, even setting the stage for the drastic Nazi Nuremberg laws that passed in 1935 that was crystal knocked and ever behind within there. So that was a key change of that book that then got built on through the centuries. In 337, Constantinus II again passed the formal edict, if you marry a Jew, that is a death penalty. 367 to 376, St. Hilary of Poitiers said, a Jew is a perverse person whom God has cursed forever. Again, these are game changer people. 418, Jerome, while translating the Vulgate, wrote and added within there how the Jews mocked God crucified while the Gentiles honored God crucified. Melnick says within there, anti-Judaism in theory soon became anti-Semitism in practice during the time of the Middle Ages. So that's early church. We're going to have a quick, brief look at the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages there starts from the Byzantine Empire from 500 through to 1000 of the Christian area. That of legal restrictions growing more and more, and again, spasmodic persecutions that came up. So many people point out, but there were times of peaceful coexistence. You do Googling search, but there was times of peaceful coexistence. But that's like saying that an abusive spouse is great. 80% of the time, they only abuse 20% of the time. Well, the fact is they shouldn't abuse at all. At this time last year, Anna and myself were in Warsaw, and we went through a museum called Polin. Polin is the Museum of History of the Polish Jews, and they showed the times of Jews in Poland, where the time of peace, but all of a sudden out of nowhere, massive persecutions happening. Again, there's no justification for the 20% of abuse times, especially where millions of Jews are murdered in the name of the church, in the name of Jesus. Again, the Russian pogroms later did that. Again, we want to quickly look at the High Middle Ages. 9 crusades span from 1095 through to the 1300s, originally authorized by the Pope against the Muslims who'd taken over the Holy Land and were persecuting Christians in the church there. And then later various kings and rulers took up the crusade actions to do 9 of them. But the problem is when the Crusaders went through there, they didn't bother distinguishing between Jews and Muslims, and in fact justified killing Jews, claiming they were avenging the death of Christ. It's estimated over 300,000 Jews were in the land when the Crusaders came through. At the end of the time, there's only about 300 Jews. You say, where were the Jews in the land of Israel? Well, they got wiped out all the time. They actually had a phrase where kill a Jew and save your soul. Later, the Russian pogroms picked up on that chant to say kill a Jew and save Russia. The blood libel that came in the high times of the High Middle Ages, the blood libel, Jews killed the Christ, avenged the blood of Christ. The accusations that Jews also went out and they killed Christian, and also the Muslims said they killed Muslim children, and they used the blood to make the Pesach matzah, and they used the blood for other festivals of the high holidays. The latest blood libel of that comes out of Israel. Israel does a lot of treatment in the hospital of Muslim people, even children. But tragically, instead of saying thank you to Israel for that, they say that Israel's harvesting organs from out of people that they're doing operations with. Absolute lie within there, but honest reporting, put that up as a thing here. Honest Reporting has just recently written a whole article about Israeli organ harvesting is back, and they're saying that that's one of the reasons why Hamas invaded into Israel. A game changer happened at the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, and there they made it official what's called transubstantiation. That's where the bread that the priest used in the Catholic Mass and the wine that they use transfers into being that of bread to being the actual body of Yeshua and the actual blood of Yeshua. So it's not symbol, it's the actual blood, the actual body of Yeshua. And from that time on, there came this accusation that Jews had come in and touched the wafer, therefore touched the actual body of Yeshua, and they were trying to kill the Messiah all over again. And that became a blood libel, and that became a charge that so many used against the Jewish community, and out of that, hundreds of thousands of Jews were killed over the history by those accusations that the Jews had touched the body of Messiah. Within this time frame, by the way, from the time of 1215 and this Fourth Lateran Council, Jews in many parts of Europe were required to wear a badge on their clothing to signify that they were Jewish. Later, Hitler gets everybody to wear the yellow Star of David to signify they're Jewish. That didn't come in a vacuum. He's picking up at what it done all the way back from 1215. It's interesting, this charge against touching the body of Messiah by touching the, the wafer, even in 510, 26 Jews were killed and beheaded because they desecrated the host, is what the phrase is, desecrated the host. And the last recorded action of that is actually in 1613 within there, and hundreds of thousands were killed during that time frame. Through this, the accusations went through the blood libel. Michael Brown records there in the 1930s, the German magazine, Der Stürmer, routinely carried illustrations of rabbis sucking blood out of German children. Now, did that real picture? No, of course not. They were cartoons of joined within there. Through the high Middle Ages, from the thousands through to the 1300s and beyond, there were many trade boycotts against the Jewish people. Jews were not allowed to have jobs. They weren't allowed to own land. They weren't allowed to have property. They were expelled from out of many of the offices and jobs they held. What could they do? You can loan money. Well, how do you get money if you can't get a job? It was a joke against them, mocked them by doing that. However, Jewish ingenuity kicks in, and Jewish people began to loan money. And all of a sudden, the governments realized, and the people around that, the Jews were making money, so they forced heavy taxes on them for their money lending, as well as other economic and social pressures, unless the Jews converted, of course. But the problem is because they then raised heavy taxes on what the Jews were earning, so that the Jews had to increase the interest rate. And it kept going up and up and up like this. And that's where the cycle came in of calling them as being greedy Jews. So if you ever heard of the phrase greedy Jews, that's where it comes in from. Unfortunately and tragically, Christian leaders, Christian states, Christian countries successively banned Judaism, banned Jewish practices. The synagogues, forced baptisms happened within there. Lengthy renunciation. If someone wanted to accept Christianity, you might say, or accept Jesus, lengthy renunciations of Judaism, of Jewish life, of Jewish family, and you had to publicly eat a feed of pork to prove that you'd actually done that. So again, this went back and forth. By the way, all those heavy taxes and economic social restrictions are found in today's modern boycott, diverse sanctions, the BDS movement of today. In 1190, we find the entire Jewish community of York was massacred, over 150 people, and the reason why is because, as similar in other parts of England and Europe, it was led by those people who owed money to the money lenders. So what's the best way to cancel your debt? Cancel the people whom you owe the debt to. So again, back and forth this goes. In 1219, Edward I threw all the Jews out of England. Wasn't going to be the first time. It was the first time, but wasn't going to be the last time. In fact, Jews weren't officially legally returned to England until the 17th century, although others came back in within that time. The end of the 13th century, Jews had been expelled out of France, out of Germany, and out of other countries and other areas around there. Tragically, the Black Death that went from 1347 to 1351 were fully blamed on the Jews. Again and again, these were blamed on there, and thousands of Jews get butchered. The Spanish Inquisition, 1492, Ferdinand II of Aragon and Isabella expelled the Jews out of Spain. Others were forced to convert to Catholicism. What's the Inquisition? The Inquisition means an inquiry into making sure the converted Jews were not living Jewishly at home. And so they did this inquisition or inquiry against them. Europe ranged in that tolerance from for Jews to extreme violence, where tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands and millions eventually killed. Jewish ghettos were set up during this time. The ghetto didn't happen in the Second World War, in the Shoah. It happened first before then. Pogroms, organized mass killings and destruction of properties that took place. So it's got to be better in the Reformation. Yes? No. Luther, sadly, tragically, turned against the Jewish people. Listen to his 7 points that he said against the Jewish people, and see if you recognize what happened in the Shoah, in the Holocaust. First, the synagogue should be set on fire. Second, their homes should likewise be broken down and destroyed. Third, they should be deprived of their prayer books and Talmuds. Fourth, their rabbis must be forbidden under the threat of death to teach no more. Fifth, passport and traveling privileges should absolutely be forbidden to the Jews. Sixth, they ought to be stopped from that's charging interest on their loans. Seventh, let the young and strong Jews and Jewesses be given the file, the axe, the hoe. They ought to drive the rascally lazy bones out of our system, therefore away with them, that we might be free from this insufferable, devilish burden that is the Jews. Throughout Germany, you find what they call Judenschwein, of Jewish people doing horrible things to pigs. The bottom one you see there of a rabbi forcing his hand up the butt of a pig, up the tuchus of a pig. That's found throughout Germany, and to this day they refuse to take them down. Into the 19th century, the Jews again became increasingly targeted, no longer sadly because of theological or religious reasons, but actually now just because of their race. In the 1880s in Russia, the pogroms increased and were done in conjunction with the Russian Orthodox Church. 1/3 of Jews would be converted, 1/3 starved, and 1/3 deported, kicked out of the country. So what choice do you want to be? Do you want to convert? Do you want to be starved? Do you want to be thrown out? If you've seen the movie Fiddler on the Roof, it's from this time, and that's where the mass immigration started into Israel and the kibbutzim movement came in. In 1903, there was a horrible book written of global Jewish conspiracy called The Protocols of the Elders of Zion. That book has been constantly reproduced in Arabic throughout the Muslim world because it speaks so strongly against Jewish people. In 1894 through to 1906, there was a court case where Captain Alfred Dreyfus, a Jewish officer in the French army, was falsely accused of espionage. He was later found innocent, but the court case dragged on. He was basically there because he was Jewish, but a young reporter from Hungary, Austria, called Theodor Herzl covered the case. And out of observing this, he said Jews need a homeland. And he was the one who held the first Jewish Congress and said in 5 years, definitely in 50 years, there will be a state of Israel. But the atrocities of Hitler and Nazism happened through all of what we've seen. And the biggest one, obviously, that of the Holocaust, 6 million Jews murdered, which is a study in and of itself. Sadly, Luther influenced Hitler's final solution. One of the great scholars of the day who actually wrote the New Testament Theological Dictionary, Gerhard Gittel, he published a whole article on how to handle the Jewish question. He said extermination's impractical. Zionism going to Israel is out because you're going to upset the Arabs and we need their oil. Assimilation will be worst of all because that would corrupt the pure German race. So let them be kicked out. Unfortunately, the architects of the Holocaust came up with make extermination as being fully practical, and we know the horror that took place of 6 million being wiped out. Kristallnacht, we're actually celebrating the 50th anniversary, which is around the date of 7th of October, which was Simchat Torah. Most of you should know this. And that's when the Muslims decided to attack with Hamas on both the date remembering Kristallnacht and also that of rejoicing in God's Torah. Again, the cycle goes all the way back to eradicate Jewish people and his word. Sadly, the silence of the Catholic and Protestant churches enabled Hitler's final solution to the Jewish problem. I just briefly want to quickly look at here that of Islamic anti-Semitism. By the way, look at the Religion of Peace stats on the right-hand side of the screen. That was taken off the issues today. Note how many attacks and deaths it's happening. Imagine if Baptists did this. They'd be banned around the world. But this just happens all the time, constantly. Islam, as you know, there is a word that means submit with Muhammad, and he first of all reached out to get support of the Jews, especially in the city of Medina, which was a Jewish city, and he then, once got into Medina, welcomed in by the Jews. He then turned on them and began, from that time on, which is about 627, began a history of betrayal and of executions, of rape and enslavement against Jewish people. Jews were considered second class. They were dhimmis. They were put under heavy jizya tax. Judaism restricted. They had forced conversions to Islam. And Quran has about 100 verses actually calling for the eradication of infidels, by which mostly they mean Jews as well as Christians. In modern days, Jews were expelled. Most of you should know there are actually more Jewish refugees in the 1940s, late 30s and 1940s than what there ever were of Palestinian refugees who actually voluntarily left their homes. But also I want to just mention Hajj Amin al-Hassini, who was the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. First, he welcomed the Jews back at the turn of the century, but quickly stood against the Jews. And he wrote, according to Brown on page 54, the entire Jewish population in Palestine must be destroyed or driven into the sea. Does it sound like from the river to the sea? That's where it started back in the 1920s, from the river to the sea, even before Israel became a nation. And he said, Allah has bestowed on us, that is the Muslims, the rare privilege of finishing what Hitler only began. Let jihad begin, murder the Jews, murder them all. Anti-Semitism and Islamic persecution started long before Israel became a nation and continued all the way through. Again, Palestinian, by the way, actually referred to the Jewish people, not the Arabs. In fact, Arabs refused the word Palestinian. I am Arab. I'm not a Palestinian. I am an Arab was a common statement all the way through until Yasser Arafat changed that after 1967. By the way, Arafat was not a Palestinian. Arafat's an Egyptian who used the Palestinian cause to make himself famous and become a multi-billionaire. Hamas, Hezbollah, and Palestinian Authority, within their charters and constitution, exists for the sole purpose of eradicating Israel. They don't have the purpose to form a state of Palestine. Israel, look at the map here, all the green being all the Arab states. Here we have a grain of sand sticking in the eye of Islam. That sticking there in that eye of Islam is a Palestinian, is an Israeli state, therefore it has to be removed. And again, Israel's accused today, even with the attacks down in Hamas, of doing genocide, of doing ethnic cleansing, of doing apartheid. However, if Israel's doing apartheid, if it's doing genocide, if it's doing ethnic cleansing, it's doing the worst job possible. Because during the time frame of this genocide, the numbers of Arab people, Muslim people in places like Gaza, the West Bank, and even within Israel proper has massively increased in the last number of years. What about Israel in other Arab countries? They've massively decreased. So Israel's the worst at doing genocide. That's the one area they haven't achieved in. The sad thing is, modern faces of anti-Semitism. First of all, I think the silence of the church is one of the most horrific things of all. The silence of the church, silence from the pogroms, silence from the Shoah, the Holocaust, silence of the church when terrorists versus Israel. I'm shocked at the silence of the church with how that the Hamas came in with their massive atrocities. We could spend the whole evening talking about the atrocities that was done. The church still embraces replacement theology. The church so often still teaches the Jews will be saved after the rapture. So you don't have to reach out to the Jewish people to accept Yeshua as their Messiah. They'll be saved after the rapture. If you said that about any other people group, you'd be declared as being racist. And sadly, many in the evangelical church these days have turned against Israel. The United States, the Presbyterian Church has embraced the BDS movement, taken away all the investment from Israel and banned any investment to Israel or any Jewish concern. There is a movement called Toward the Jerusalem Council number 2, and that's a great movement from within the church and the Messianic Jewish community. Can Jews believe and remain Jewish? And the answer is yes. Again, that's another whole topic on itself. But the media bias shown the terrorist press releases and body counts. I don't know about you in the USA, but here in Australia, our morning news are filled with reports straight from that of Hamas. And the body count is the Hamas body count. And the UN has passed hundreds of resolutions against Israel. Not once have they ever passed a resolution against any terrorist organization that attacks Israel. And again, the police in action here in Australia, they're in the Opera House. We've had marches in our Jewish community here, and the police just left them. In fact, the Muslims did a massive march outside a Chabad synagogue here within walking distance where we live here. And the police told those in the synagogue to go home. We can't protect you. They should have got rid of the Muslim violence, but they didn't. They told the Jews to go home. Absolutely astounding. And again, Israel having the right to defend itself. That map up the top there is Israel just released a travel watch list. Now Australia has been put on Israel's travel watch. A shocking thing. America, you're still on the green list, but Australia's now on the amber list. Again, the phrases of "we love the Jews, we're just against Israel," the chants "from the river to the sea," which means to eradicate Israel, the denying of the Holocaust, the saying that the Jews financed World War II and other wars. And again, the boycott, diverse sanction movement, the accusations the Jews are secretly working with communists to take over the world. The Jews are taking over the banks. The Jews control the banks. I said to someone who was trying to tell me that one time, if the Jews controlled the banks, they'd be in a far better financial situation in the world, because the Jews would be able to handle the money better than the people that are running the banks now. The accusation that the Jews in Israel today are not the real Jews. They're a remote European group, the Khazars. That's another whole thing. Again and again, we find these things being taught. So what's the answer, folks? Well, the answer is it is a spiritual battle. It is an ancient spiritual battle. And we need to push back, first of all, with the replacement theology. God has not replaced his people whom he foreknew. Paul states it clearly in Romans against the replacement theology of his day. And it's to seek to reach out to Israel and the Jewish people now, not after the rapture. Support Messianic Jewish congregations and movements that are supporting Jews in Israel and the many peace rallies that are happening. Isn't it interesting that the peace rally happens for Israel? It's peaceful, but the Muslims come out and it's absolutely violent. And in Australia, the violence is increasing. Push back against the media bias, the social media platforms, push back on them, write to the politicians. Make sure you read the Israeli news, Jerusalem Post, the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces, that of Honest Reporting, and so many other ones within there. But another big one, stand back against the moral equivalence efforts, all those ones that try to say, yeah, but think what the Jews did, think what the Jews did. Psalm 122, pray for the peace of Jerusalem. May those who prosper who love you. So, folks, I have been on a very fast teaching time here at the moment. Rabbi Larry, back to you. I don't know if you want to leave it open for question times from there.
Well, we were giving you an hour. You took up the hour, I'm not going to give you the last word yet, though. You have the last word, just not yet. Because I do want to still open it up to a couple of questions, even just a few from here and a few from people on the internet. I wanted to say, just though, on your last slide, your first point was prayer because it's an ancient spiritual battle. This is so true, and I constantly tell people that anti-Semitism is directly from Satan. And the reason that he wants it to happen is because the same reason right from the very start to the end is he's trying to take over the throne. If he can get rid of the Jewish people, he can take the throne, because it means that Messiah will never return. He tried to stop Messiah from returning numerous times. He thought when he killed him on the stake, aha, I finally won. Of course not. And he's still trying to keep him from returning. But we know he'll have final say. You have anything about that? Want to say?
Amen. I mean, I love the phrase that you probably heard yourself as well, that without Hanukkah, there would not have been a Christmas. Because the Jewish people, without Hanukkah, there would not have been Christmas.
Amen.
Because the purpose of Antiochus Epiphanes was to wipe out the Jewish people. And if that had been successful there would not have been Yeshua born, because Israel would have been wiped out. So without Hanukkah, there would not have been a Christmas.
Amen. So we're going to take a couple of questions. Does anyone in the house here have a question they want to ask? Okay, we're going to do it through the microphone. Sherry?
Yes. Why is the building of the temple so important for Jewish people?
The building of the temple for the Jewish people is actually more important for the Christian people. I hear it more from Christians than what I ever do hear from Jewish people. if Judaism goes out and now builds a temple, per se, because they don't even have temple plans ready to go. So if it's important for Jewish people, you have a plan ready to go. There is no plans ready for the Jewish, for the building of the temple. That's been accepted by the main rabbis. Christians talk more about a third temple. People ask me, because of my studies on Ezekiel, about the third temple. And I say, well, the third temple's already been built, and I'm looking at it right now. So it says there clearly in Romans, don't you know that you are the temple, the house of the Ruach HaKodesh? You are the third temple. The Jewish people aren't looking for a temple. They talk about the temple, but no one's going out there to push for it to be built. Because they would have to admit that 2,000 years of Judaism, which is built on the principle that blood sacrifices are no longer needed, that 2,000 years of history is wrong. So again, I hear far more of preaching from the church and Gentiles about a third temple than what I ever do from Jewish people.
Yeah, I would have to say that if there's going to be a third temple, it's going to be Messiah's body that's going to be raised up, not as that.
Well, Paul said that even in Corinthians chapter 3, verse 16. You're it. You are the third temple.
All right, let's take one question from the internet, and then maybe we'll come back here for another. Who's got
Henrietta, I see you've got your hand up there.
Yes, I just wanted to say thank you so much. My journey has been one through several religions. And I got my degree from a Catholic university, but my question to you was, how can we, as former Christians, that may not be the right word to use, because I still believe in Yeshua, but I believe that the Jewish ways are the ways that Yeshua presented to us on earth as Gentiles. How do we start to counteract the replacement theology?
Sure, great question. I have a whole teaching on that. Maybe Rabbi Larry will let me bring that whole teaching for you on replacement theology. Yeah, it really has to. And that's where individually we push back on it by pointing out even what the scriptures say, that God's covenant with Israel are everlasting, they're eternal. If my promises to Israel can be wiped out, then heaven and earth will pass away. So there's a whole pushback where we push back individually, stand for Jewish people, stand for Israel. But that, Henrietta, is a key question. And I say again, for you, it's so great to see you sitting, obviously, in your home rather than in a hospital bed like last time I saw you. God's miracle. Yeah. Amen.
Yeah, I'd have to say that if you really want to say something, say that, well, you know, God said he was going to be everlasting in the old covenant. Are you saying that God changed, or he's changed his mind? And if that's the case, is he going to change his mind again, that it's not going to be Messiah's blood soon? So that's impossible. He can't change. He doesn't change like that, and he never changes his mind. You know? Sure. And another question from in-house.
Just a quick question about the Jews and the church. Can you briefly explain how it came about that the church, as we know it in the New Testament, as it was started by Jews and went on as Jews? How was it now that it's totally Gentile and the Jews were filtered out? Because I think that is probably what gives people the impression that God's done with the Jews. I don't know if that, yeah.
We covered that a little bit earlier on in the session, but what happened was that, first of all, the message of Yeshua went outside of Israel. For the first 15 years, it's totally Jewish. Then it went outside Israel into the world. And in the world, there were more Gentiles than what there were Jews. So all of a sudden, now more Gentiles became believers in Yeshua, which is awesome and fantastic. But in so doing, you had Gentiles coming in who didn't know anything about Israel, didn't know anything about Jewish people, and they began to come into leadership positions. And there's these customs they knew nothing about, although they're in the Bible. They had already started to have this pushback by those influence of church leadership to whereby that of Jewish practices were considered wrong, even though they're established there in the Bible. And so sadly and tragically, there comes this big pushback, and slowly that of Israel, that of Judaism slowly gets pushed out. The more the Gentile numbers came in and totally outnumbered the Jews, that's where the problem started. We find that in the book of Romans. That's why Romans was written, because of that already happening in Paul's time frame.
All right, thank you. I missed that from the first. I came in late. Thank you.
Right. Okay. Yes. Sure.
Thank you.
One more question first. Anything in the house?
There's another, replacement theology, but there's another, or I suppose if you call it a doctrine, it's called preterism, which I also believe is against the Jewish people, because it really cuts them out of the end time situation. But I've since found out that preterism was actually created by a Jesuit priest. So that's got to tell you something.
Yeah, well, all those ways of interpreting Revelation come into effect. Some of them, again, anything that puts that don't reach the Jews now, because they will be saved after the rapture. That's a teaching to me as a doctrine of demons, because we reach Jewish people now, not after the rapture, because who knows actually when the rapture will take place. The millennials will say that the rapture that does not take place at all. So let's reach Jewish people today for their Messiah. Back to you, Larry. I think you were looking for a question in the house.
The scripture says that the only way to salvation is through the fire and the blood, and it doesn't say except for the Jews.
Exactly.
So if you're not reaching out to them and you turn your back on them, what you said is, never mind, you have no place. And that's just not. All right, I think we need to wrap it up.
I think Naomi had one question there, and then she had put her hand up there.
Thank you. Can you explain Romans 11?
You mean the whole chapter?
11? No, just the verse, because it almost implies that God allowed the Jews to fall. It was part of his plan, it almost seems, right? So if we're supposed to provoke them to jealousy, that's all part of the plan. But then on the verse 12, if their fall is riches for the world and their failure riches for the Gentile, how much more their fullness? Yeah. Doesn't that mean that he's going to recompense them, reward them? Does that, am I reading this wrong? So how does replacement theology justify this?
Sure. I have a whole teaching on that, but trying to give it in a nutshell, this comes down to, did God plan for them to go and for the Jewish people to fall? No. Not that God planned it, but God in his divine foreknowledge knew what would happen. But again, remember when Paul comes back from his journey, and we read this in Acts 21, Acts 22, comes back from his journey from out there, he's told, look how many uncountable number of Jews there are who believe and who are zealous for the Torah. So unfortunately, though, the leaders didn't go and accept Yeshua. Again, afraid of losing their position a lot of times, like even today. But yes, we have to remember that the verse 12 immediately after actually does say, if their life coming back is going to be, if they're falling away is riches, how much more they're coming back in again is life from the dead. And we're finding that happening today with the Messianic Jewish community coming back in, and so many Jews becoming believers and are now able to, put it bluntly, correct a lot of the weird teachings that we've found that the church have done over the years, where they haven't understood Jewish culture and Jewish issues, and they plucked something out of the air. When I was ministering at the Garden Tomb, which last year I was able to do with my wife alongside me, and she's in one booth and I'm in the other booth, and given the message of the death, burial, resurrection of Yeshua, a moment or live the rest of my life. But the number of times people would raise up then, but I heard my pastor say this, but I heard it preach that. And you sit there and you have this facepalm moment and think, please don't. But there's so much crazy teaching out of there because so much of the church don't understand the Jewish culture of this text, and so they invent it themselves. A classic one of the napkin was folded up and laid neatly in the tomb, because at the end of a meal, all the Jews who finished the meal neatly fold up the napkin to show that they've finished and it's all over. I don't know one Jew who does that. We're messy eaters. And, mess goes everywhere. It would have been his tallit that's folded up, not a napkin after he finishes eating. But that's just one of many examples I could give within there. But anyway,
I want to thank you for this conference, because I learned a lot of things. One of the main reasons I wanted to know was why Jews were hated so much, and it came from all angles. But, I excluded the Christians from it. I wasn't thinking, but it was mainly because of that. It seems that because they crucified Christ, the whole world hated them, or they use that as an excuse, right?
They use an excuse. It happened way before then.
Wow.
Yeah.
So, okay. So thank you very much.
Yes, thank you.
It was a fantastic synopsis of history and a true teaching of what's going on. So let's close up with a moment of prayer. Father, we just thank you for this time that we've had together.